David, a once marginalized black boy mocked by childhood friends Mike and Ray for his race, returns from the military as a highly decorated officer. Confronting their racist past, Mike grapples with guilt, while Ray stubbornly resists change, clinging to denial. But what he does next will shock you. Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today, and if you like this story, don't forget to subscribe. Mike and Ray had known each other since the age of 7. They grew up in the same neighborhood, attended the same schools, and even worked at the same factory for a while after high school. Their bond was tight, formed over a shared love for football, cheap beer, and the small-town life that shaped them. They'd always been able to count on each other, especially when life threw curveballs. But somewhere along the way, their camaraderie also solidified a certain worldview, one where they saw themselves as being superior to anyone who wasn't like them. They both grew up in a predominantly white, blue-collar town in the Midwest. Their town wasn't openly hostile to minorities, at least not in public, but there was an undercurrent of racism that shaped the conversations at the bar, in the break room at work, and around dinner tables. Subtle jokes, sideways comments, and unspoken hierarchies were just part of the culture, and Mike and Ray had internalized those values without question. Life hadn't been kind to them in terms of financial success, but they believed that, somehow, they were still better off than the black families that moved into town or the immigrants who took jobs at the nearby distribution center. Mike had a construction job that paid decently, but it wasn't stable, and work was often sporadic. Ray, on the other hand, had bounced from job to job, working in warehouses and driving trucks. Both men spent most of their evenings at Pete's Tavern, where the regulars were just as disillusioned as they were, often talking about how the country had changed for the worse. The conversations were always the same. Complaints about politics, minorities getting special treatment, and how people like them were being forgotten. One afternoon, they were at Pete's, sitting at their usual booth, nursing their beers. Ray, always the louder of the two, was going off about some news story he'd heard earlier. "Did you hear about that black kid who got into the academy?" "What a joke," Ray scoffed, shaking his head. Affirmative action at work again, giving them a free ride. Mike chuckled, though not as heartily as Ray had hoped. "Yeah, well, that's the way it goes. They give 'em all the breaks, and we're left scraping by." It wasn't a new conversation for them. Ray often vented his frustrations this way, and Mike would usually agree, though sometimes a small part of him wondered if they were wrong. But it was easier to go along with Ray's rants than to question them. As they continued to talk, their conversation drifted to their old friend, David. "You remember David, right?" Ray said with a laugh. "Wonder whatever happened to him." "Yeah, I remember. Haven't thought about him in years," Mike replied. David had been the third member of their trio when they were kids. He was one of the only black kids in their school, and while they had been friends, Mike and Ray never really treated him like an equal. They often teased him, making racist jokes that David would laugh off, eager to fit in. Looking back, Mike wasn't proud of how they had treated him, but he hadn't thought much of it at the time. "Last I heard, he went off and joined the army," Ray said with a sneer. "Figures. Probably had to get out of this town before someone told him to his face what we all thought of him." Mike shrugged, uncomfortable but unwilling to challenge Ray's perspective. "Yeah, I guess." The conversation shifted, and soon they were back to talking about work, their frustrations with the economy, and how things used to be better. But David's name lingered in the back of Mike's mind. It had been a few weeks since that conversation about David, and Mike and Ray were heading out of Pete's Tavern after their usual Friday night routine. The cool evening air hit their faces as they stepped out, the neon sign from the bar buzzing faintly in the background. As they walked down the street, a tall man in uniform approached them, his boots clicking against the pavement. Mike noticed him first, but it took a moment for recognition to sink in. The man was wearing an impeccably clean and pressed military uniform, his chest decorated with a series of ribbons and medals. He moved with the kind of confidence that caught people's attention. "Evening, fellas," the man said, his deep voice smooth but commanding. There was something familiar in his tone, but Mike couldn't place it at first. He squinted, studying the man's face. Then it hit him. "David?" Mike blurted out, his voice full of disbelief. The man smiled, and it was a smile Mike hadn't seen in years. "That's right. David Lawrence." Ray's mouth hung open, and for a moment, both of them were too stunned to say anything. They hadn't seen David since he'd left town, and the man standing before them was a far cry from the shy, eager-to-please boy they remembered. Now he was tall, strong, and clearly a man of authority. "You guys don't look like you've changed a bit," David said, his tone warm but with an edge of something else, something Mike couldn't quite place. Ray, still caught off guard, finally spoke. "Wow, man, you really made something of yourself, huh? Look at all those medals. You must be doing all right for yourself." David nodded. "Yeah, the Army's been good to me. I've been through a lot, learned a lot. It's been a long journey, but it's paid off. I'm back in town for some official business. Thought I'd check out the old place." Mike felt an unease growing in his chest. He could feel the tension, the unspoken history between them all. David didn't seem angry or resentful, but there was something in the way he looked at them that made Mike feel small, like a child caught in a lie. "Well, damn," Ray said, still trying to process the situation. "I mean, I always figured you'd do okay, but, man, I didn't expect to see you like this." David smiled again, though this time there was something sharper in it. "People can surprise you." They stood there in awkward silence for a moment. Mike felt like he should say something, anything, to ease the tension, but his mind was blank. "So, what brings you back here?" Mike finally asked, trying to sound casual. "Work," David replied. "I'm actually stationed nearby for the next few months. I've got some high-level operations to oversee." Ray whistled. "High-level, huh? What, you running the place now?" David's smile widened, but there was no humor in it. "Something like that." As David walked away, leaving Mike and Ray standing there in stunned silence, Mike felt a wave of memories wash over him. He hadn't thought about their childhood much over the years. The things they said to David, the way they treated him, it had all seemed harmless at the time. They were just kids, joking around, right? But now, standing there on the street, Mike couldn't shake the feeling that they had been wrong. He remembered the way they used to tease David, how they'd call him names and make fun of his skin color. David would always laugh along with them, but there were moments when Mike saw the hurt in his eyes. He remembered one time in particular, back when they were about 13. They were playing basketball at the local court, just the three of them. Ray had made some offhand comment about David's skin blending in with the night, and Mike had laughed, though it hadn't been that funny. David had laughed too, but his smile didn't reach his eyes. Mike had noticed, but he hadn't said anything. Now, as he stood there thinking about it, Mike realized that those moments must have been more painful than they had ever understood. David had been their friend, but they had never treated him like an equal. They had always made him feel like an outsider, even when they pretended to include him. Ray, on the other hand, didn't seem to have any of these thoughts. As they started walking again, Ray let out a low whistle. "Man, can you believe that? David Lawrence, running things in the Army. Who would have thought?" Mike didn't respond. His mind was racing, flooded with memories he hadn't thought about in years. David had changed. He had grown into someone powerful, someone important. And Mike couldn't shake the feeling that they had been part of the reason he'd left in the first place. "Remember how we used to mess with him?" Ray continued, chuckling to himself. "Man, he was such a pushover back then. Always trying to fit in, always trying to prove he was one of us." Mike stopped walking. "Yeah, I remember," he said quietly, his voice heavy with guilt. Ray glanced at him, confused. "What's up with you? You seem off." Mike shook his head. "I don't know. Just thinking about some stuff." Ray shrugged. Don't sweat it. He's doing fine now. Better than fine, actually. He's probably forgotten all about that crap from back in the day." But Mike wasn't so sure. Mike couldn't shake the encounter with David, no matter how hard he tried. It gnawed at him for days, creeping into his thoughts at the most random moments, while he was working, eating dinner, or even lying in bed trying to sleep. Ray, on the other hand, seemed to shrug the whole thing off, chalking it up as just another encounter with an old friend who had gotten lucky. "Man, you're overthinking it," Ray said one evening while they were drinking at Pete's. "David's doing fine. He's got some medals, sure, but it's not like he's the president or anything. You're acting like we did something wrong." Mike couldn't put it into words, but something about the encounter with David didn't sit right with him. He found himself thinking back to all the little moments from their childhood, the times when they had teased David or made him feel small. He wondered if those moments had left deeper scars on David than they had realized. "You really think he just moved on?" Mike asked, staring into his beer. Ray shrugged. "Why not? Look, we gave him a hard time, but it was all in good fun. He probably doesn't even remember half the stuff we said." Mike wasn't so sure. He remembered David's eyes when they'd run into him. There had been warmth in his greeting, but something else had lingered beneath the surface, something sharper. And it had been there in the way David smiled at them. Not a malicious smile, but one that seemed to carry the weight of all the years since they'd last seen him. Mike couldn't tell if David had truly moved on or if he was just hiding something deeper. A few days later, Mike was surprised to receive a phone call from David himself. The call was brief, polite. David mentioned that there was a military banquet coming up, an event where several high-ranking officials and local community members would be in attendance. He said he thought it would be nice if Mike and Ray came along. "You want us to come?" Mike asked, surprised. "Yeah, it'd be good to catch up properly," David said. "We didn't get much time to talk the other day. It'll be a formal event, but it's not too fancy. You guys should come." Mike hesitated for a moment, unsure if he wanted to accept. But something about the invitation felt important, like David was offering him an opportunity, though he couldn't quite figure out what that opportunity was. "All right, yeah," Mike said. "I'll be there." David hung up, leaving Mike to stew in his thoughts. He called Ray to tell him about the banquet, and Ray, as usual, didn't take it seriously. "See? I told you, man," Ray said, laughing. "He's probably just showing off a bit, wanting to play the big shot. You know how these army guys are." But for Mike, the invitation felt like more than just a casual reunion. He couldn't shake the feeling that this banquet would be different, that it would dredge up something deeper between him, Ray, and David. The day of the banquet arrived sooner than expected, and Mike was filled with a strange sense of dread. He hadn't attended anything even remotely formal in years, and he wasn't sure what to expect. He dusted off an old suit that had been hanging in his closet, one he'd worn to a wedding years ago, and stood in front of the mirror, adjusting his tie with shaking hands. He didn't know why he felt so nervous. After all, this was just a military banquet, nothing more than a chance to see David again, maybe catch up over some food and drinks. But deep down, Mike knew it was more than that. This wasn't just about reconnecting with an old friend. It was about confronting the man David had become and the person Mike himself had been in the past. Ray, on the other hand, seemed almost excited about the event. When they met up to carpool to the banquet, Ray was wearing a suit that looked slightly too small for him, his shirt collar straining against his neck. But he was in good spirits, cracking jokes and laughing as they drove to the event. "Can't wait to see how many medals David's got hanging off his chest," Ray said with a chuckle. "Think he's got enough to tip him over?" Mike forced a laugh, but inside, he felt uneasy. Ray's attitude was beginning to bother him. It was as if Ray couldn't take any of this seriously, as if he didn't understand that this night was more than just a chance to rub elbows with some military officers. Mike wanted to tell him to shut up, but he stayed quiet. The banquet hall was large and grand, with a high ceiling and walls decorated with military insignia. Uniformed officers mingled with civilians, and the room buzzed with conversation and laughter. Mike felt out of place the moment he stepped inside, and Ray's loud voice and easygoing demeanor didn't help. The two of them stuck out like sore thumbs among the well-dressed crowd. They were greeted at the door by a younger officer who checked their names off a list and pointed them toward their table. It was near the back of the room, far from the stage where the main events of the evening would unfold. As they sat down, Mike couldn't help but feel a growing sense of anxiety. He hadn't seen David yet, and he wondered how the night would go. Would they talk about the past? Would David bring up the things they had done, the way they had treated him? Or would he keep it all buried beneath the surface, pretending like it never happened? Ray, meanwhile, was completely at ease, laughing and joking with anyone who passed by. He seemed to enjoy being part of the event, even though he didn't really belong. Mike noticed how Ray kept making comments under his breath about the people around them, about how military types were all the same, about how they were probably all lining up for promotions based on diversity quotas. But Mike wasn't listening to Ray anymore. His eyes were scanning the room, looking for David. When David finally appeared, it was impossible to miss him. He walked into the banquet hall with an air of quiet authority, his uniform immaculate, his chest adorned with medals and ribbons. He moved through the crowd easily, shaking hands and exchanging pleasantries with high-ranking officials. Even from a distance, Mike could see the respect that David commanded from everyone around him. Ray let out a low whistle. "Look at him, Mr. Big Shot." Mike didn't say anything. He was too busy watching David, trying to make sense of the man who now seemed so different from the boy they had known. David had grown into someone powerful, someone important. And as he approached their table, Mike felt a lump form in his throat. "Mike, Ray," David greeted them with a warm smile, though there was still that sharpness in his eyes. "Glad you guys could make it." "Wouldn't miss it," Ray said, grinning. "You've sure come a long way since the old neighborhood, huh?" David chuckled, but it was a polite laugh, one that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Yeah, I guess you could say that." They made small talk for a few minutes, mostly about the banquet and the various military officials in attendance. Mike found it hard to concentrate on the conversation. He kept wondering if David was going to bring up the past, if he was going to call them out for the way they had treated him all those years ago. But David didn't mention it. Not yet. Instead, David spoke about his career, how he had risen through the ranks, how he had been given more and more responsibility as time went on. He was now one of the highest-ranking officers in the region, overseeing critical operations. Mike couldn't help but feel a strange mix of pride and guilt as he listened. Here was their childhood friend, someone they had mocked and belittled, standing before them as a decorated military officer. Ray, however, didn't seem to share Mike's conflicted emotions. He was still trying to make jokes, still acting like everything was normal. He asked David about his medals, about the different ranks and titles, and David answered politely, though Mike could sense that David was growing tired of Ray's casual demeanor. Then came the moment that Mike had been dreading, the speeches. David took to the stage as one of the main speakers of the night. The room quieted as he began to talk about his career, about the sacrifices that came with military life, and about the importance of leadership and resilience. He spoke with the kind of authority that comes from years of hard-earned experience, and Mike couldn't help but feel a swell of admiration for him. But as David continued to speak, his tone shifted. He began to talk about his upbringing, about the challenges he had faced as a young black man in a predominantly white town. He didn't mention Mike and Ray by name, but it was clear that he was talking about their shared past. "There were times when I felt like I didn't belong," David said, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "Times when I was made to feel small, to feel like I wasn't good enough. But those moments didn't break me. They made me stronger. They made me push harder, to prove to myself and to others that I could succeed." Mike felt a lump rise in his throat. He could feel the weight of David's words pressing down on him. He knew what David was talking about, the teasing, the jokes, the way they had treated him like an outsider. David had taken all of that pain and turned it into fuel for his success. As David finished his speech, the room erupted in applause. But Mike couldn't bring himself to clap. He felt ashamed of the way they had treated David, and ashamed that it had taken him this long to realize the impact their actions had on him. After the speech, David returned to their table. Mike wanted to apologize, to say something, but the words stuck in his throat. Ray, on the other hand, seemed completely unfazed. "Great speech, man," Ray said, clapping David on the back. "You really know how to work a room." David smiled, but there was no warmth in it. He turned to Mike, his eyes sharp. "What about you, Mike? What did you think of the speech?" Mike swallowed hard, feeling the weight of David's gaze. "It was powerful," he said quietly. "I didn't realize. I didn't know we—" David cut him off with a calm, measured tone. "You didn't realize how much it hurt, did you? But I don't blame you. Not anymore. I've moved on. I had to get where I am now." Mike felt a wave of guilt crash over him. David had every right to be angry, every right to hold on to the bitterness of their past. But instead, he had let it go. He had risen above it. As the banquet continued, Mike felt like he was drowning in his own guilt. Ray's flippant attitude wasn't helping, and the weight of David's words still hung heavy in the air. Every laugh and casual remark from Ray felt like a slap in the face to Mike, as if his friend was intentionally avoiding the reality of what they'd just heard. David, meanwhile, had returned to mingling with the other guests, shaking hands with high-ranking officials, exchanging smiles and nods. He looked every bit the part of a man who had moved far beyond the small-minded world Mike and Ray still inhabited. Ray leaned back in his chair, looking smug. "See, what did I tell you? He's doing just fine. All that stuff from when we were kids? Water under the bridge." Mike clenched his fists under the table. "You really think that? After what he said up there? That speech was about us, Ray." Ray rolled his eyes. "Oh, come on. You're reading too much into it. He didn't even say our names. It was just a generic 'I overcame adversity' speech. You're making this way too personal." But Mike knew it was personal. He could see it in the way David had looked at him during his speech, the subtle tension that lingered between them despite David's calm demeanor. Ray might be able to shrug it off, but Mike couldn't. He could feel the cracks forming in his relationship with Ray, cracks that had always been there but were now widening into chasms. "I'm going to talk to him," Mike said suddenly, standing up from the table. Ray looked at him incredulously. "What? Why?" "He's busy schmoozing with the brass. Let him enjoy his night." But Mike had already made up his mind. He couldn't sit in silence anymore. He couldn't pretend that everything was fine, that the past didn't matter. He needed to clear the air with David, even if it meant confronting the ugly truth about himself. He walked across the banquet hall, weaving between tables and clusters of people. As he approached David, he could feel his heart pounding in his chest. What was he even going to say? How do you apologize for years of casual racism and cruelty? How do you make up for something that has shaped someone's life, perhaps in ways you never even understood? David was in the middle of a conversation with a group of officers when he noticed Mike approaching. He excused himself and turned to face him, his expression calm but unreadable. "Mike," David said. "Everything all right?" Mike opened his mouth, but for a moment, no words came out. He could feel his face growing hot with embarrassment. Finally, he managed to stammer, "David, I need to apologize." David raised an eyebrow, his expression softening just slightly. "Apologize? For what?" "For everything," Mike said, his voice barely above a whisper. "For how we treated you. For the jokes, the teasing. For not realizing how much we hurt you." David's face remained neutral, but Mike could see a flicker of emotion in his eyes, perhaps surprise, or maybe even sadness. He took a deep breath, as if considering what to say next. "I won't lie, Mike," David said slowly. "It wasn't easy growing up with friends who treated me like that. There were times when I felt like I didn't belong anywhere. But I learned to use that pain. I turned it into fuel to get where I am today." Mike nodded, his throat tight. "I never thought about it like that. I guess we just thought it was harmless." David sighed, his eyes softening. "It wasn't harmless, Mike. It was painful. But I had to let it go, for my own sake. I couldn't carry that anger with me if I wanted to succeed." Mike felt a wave of shame wash over him. He realized now that he had been blind to the consequences of his actions, too caught up in his own worldview to see the damage he was doing to others. "I'm sorry," Mike repeated, his voice thick with emotion. "I really am." David studied him for a moment, then nodded. "I appreciate that, Mike. I really do. But the truth is, I've moved on. I had to. You've got to figure out if you're ready to do the same." Mike swallowed hard. He didn't know if he could ever fully make up for the past, but at least now, he could start trying to change. As the banquet wound down, Mike returned to the table where Ray was still sitting, looking bored and checking his phone. He could feel a tension between them now, something unspoken but undeniable. Ray had noticed Mike talking to David, but he hadn't said anything. Mike didn't know if Ray even cared about what had just happened. "So, you get what you needed?" Ray asked, not looking up from his phone. Mike hesitated. "I talked to him. Yeah. And I apologized." Ray snorted. "Apologized? For what?" "Man, you're acting like we murdered somebody. It was just a few jokes. We were kids." Mike shook his head, feeling a strange combination of anger and sadness. Ray didn't get it. He probably never would. It wasn't just jokes, Ray. We made him feel like he didn't belong. That stuff matters. Ray rolled his eyes, finally looking up at Mike. Look, you can feel guilty if you want, but I don't see what the big deal is. He's fine. Better than fine. He's a general or whatever. Why dig up the past? Because it's not about him, Mike said, his voice firm. It's about us. We did something wrong, and I'm not going to pretend like it didn't happen just because he's successful now. Ray stared at him for a moment, then shook his head. Whatever, man. You're getting soft. Mike didn't respond. He knew that Ray wouldn't change. Ray was too set in his ways, too stubborn to admit that they had been wrong. But Mike couldn't stay stuck in that mindset anymore. David's success had forced him to confront his own prejudice, and he couldn't unsee the truth. As they left the banquet hall and stepped out into the cool night air, Mike felt a strange sense of closure. He didn't know what would happen next, but he knew that something inside him had shifted. He couldn't go back to the way things were, not after everything he had realized tonight. Ray, on the other hand, was already talking about the next time they could hit up Pete's for a drink, as if nothing had changed. But for Mike, everything had. In the car on the way home, the silence between Mike and Ray was thick and uncomfortable. Ray's attempts to make small talk fell flat, and Mike barely responded. He couldn't stop thinking about David, about everything that had been said at the banquet. As they pulled into Mike's driveway, Ray gave him a sideways glance. So, you gonna keep feeling guilty about this? Mike looked at him, his expression tired but resolute. Yeah. Maybe I am. Ray sighed and shook his head. You're making this way too complicated, man. Just let it go. But Mike couldn't let it go. Not anymore. He had spent too many years pretending that the past didn't matter, pretending that the way they had treated David was just harmless fun. But now, he knew better. He couldn't go back to the way things were. Look, Ray, Mike said quietly. You do what you want. But I've got to figure some things out. Ray frowned, clearly frustrated. Figure what out? We're fine. We've always been fine. Mike opened the car door and stepped out. He looked back at Ray, his voice soft but firm. Not anymore. With that, Mike closed the door and walked toward his house, leaving Ray behind in the car. As he walked up the front steps, he felt a strange sense of relief, as if a weight had been lifted off his shoulders. He didn't know what the future held, but he knew that he couldn't keep living the way he had been. He had seen the man David had become, and it had forced him to confront the man he wanted to be. It was a painful realization, but it was a necessary one. As Mike entered his house and closed the door behind him, he knew that his life would never be the same. He didn't know if Ray would ever understand, but for the first time in his life, Mike felt like he was finally starting to see things clearly. And that was a start.